They say America is the land of opportunity. But what they don't tell you is that opportunity doesn't knock at every door. Some doors don't even have a number. His name was Marcus Elijah Cole. And on the morning this story begins, he had exactly $14.32 to his name, a cracked leather shoe on his left foot, a sneaker on his right, and a hunger in his stomach that had become such a constant companion he'd long since stopped noticing it. He was 41 years old. He had survived the streets of South Chicago through 2 brutal winters, a stint in a shelter that smelled like industrial bleach and broken promises, and 3 failed attempts at jobs that evaporated the moment his background check came back. The world had a way of reminding Marcus exactly where it thought he belonged, and that place was invisible. But Marcus Cole had a secret, not a dramatic one, not one that came with a musical sting or a flashback montage. It was quiet, humble, almost embarrassing in its simplicity. He loved horses. Not racehorses, not the kind draped in silk and glory at Churchill Downs. He loved all horses, the wild ones, the tired ones, the overlooked ones. When he was 6 years old, growing up in rural Mississippi before his family moved north, a neighbor had a sway-backed old mare named Dolly. While other kids chased each other through cornfields, Marcus would sit beside that fence for hours, just watching her breathe. She never startled around him. She'd walk right up to the fence and press her great velvet nose against his forehead, and Marcus would close his eyes like he was in church. His grandmother used to say, "Marcus, that horse knows your soul is gentle." He never forgot that. But gentle souls don't pay rent. And by the time Marcus was 41, those memories of Mississippi felt like they belonged to someone else. Some other boy in some other life, not the man now sitting on a bus stop bench outside Harrington Downs racetrack in Kentucky, wearing mismatched shoes and clutching a paper bag with a day-old sandwich inside. He hadn't meant to end up here. He'd been riding buses south, vaguely following warmth, vaguely following nothing at all. The racetrack was just a landmark, just a place to rest. Through the chain-link fence, he could see horses being walked in the early morning mist, their breath rising in soft clouds. His chest did something complicated, a tightening that was grief and love at the same time. He sat there for 2 hours. People walked past him without looking. Trainers in expensive boots, grooms with coffee cups, a couple of wealthy owners in pressed shirts, gesturing with their phones. Nobody saw him. He was furniture. He was part of the bench. There are 2 kinds of invisible. The invisible that feels like punishment, and the invisible that feels like freedom. Marcus Cole had lived both. That morning, he wasn't sure which one he was wearing. What he didn't know, what none of those people with their pressed shirts and their coffee cups knew, was that this particular morning, this particular bench, was the exact last moment of the old chapter of his life. The universe has a funny way of not announcing its pivots. The greatest doors don't creak. They just open. And somewhere inside that racetrack, behind a weathered stall at the far end of Barn 7, a horse was screaming. Not metaphorically, not poetically, a literal, violent, wall-shaking scream of a horse that had bitten 3 trainers, kicked through 2 stall gates, and been officially labeled untamable in red letters on his paddock board. His name was Devil's Sermon, and this broken, invisible man on a bus stop bench, this beggar in mismatched shoes, was the only person on earth who could save him. Neither of them knew it yet, but the morning was just getting started. There is a particular kind of laughter that has no humor in it. It is the laughter of men who have never been hungry, mocking a man who has never been full. It started with a gate guard named Pete who had a kind heart and a soft spot for people who clearly loved horses. When Marcus approached the track entrance, not to beg, just to watch, just to be near something living and powerful, Pete looked at him for a long moment and said, "You know anything about horses, friend?" Marcus said, "Some." That was enough. Pete let him in through the service entrance. Told him to stay near the outer barns, don't bother the owners. Maybe there was some mucking work if he was willing. Marcus was willing. Marcus was always willing. He spent that first morning moving hay bales and cleaning stalls and doing the invisible work that keeps a racetrack breathing. He asked for nothing except permission to keep doing it. A groom named Terry tossed him a pair of gloves and didn't ask any questions. By noon, Marcus had earned a hot meal from the track cafeteria and a corner of the tack room to sit in during the afternoon heat. Word travels fast in small communities, even ones spread across 100 acres. And the word that traveled about Marcus was, "There's a homeless man working the outer barns." That's when the laughter started. It wasn't all of them. It was specifically and memorably a cluster of 3 men who represented everything that Harrington Downs had too much of: old money, new arrogance, and zero self-awareness. Chauncey Aldrich III was a third-generation horse owner whose grandfather had built a fortune in pharmaceuticals. He had never once cleaned a stall in his life but had strong opinions about everyone who did. Prescott Scotty Webb was a semi-retired jockey-turned-horse trader who wore turquoise belt buckles and spoke in a loud braying voice that cut across conversations like a foghorn. And Davis Fontaine was a trainer with a good win record and a reputation for making the help feel small. They saw Marcus walking across the yard one afternoon, carrying a water bucket, head down, focused. Chauncey made a comment under his breath. Scotty laughed. Davis looked away, which was its own kind of participation. The comment was about his shoes. The mismatched shoes. That was all it took. One observation, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who has never had to think carefully about what he says, because consequences have never found him. He heard it. Of course he heard it. A man who has lived on the street develops ears like radar. But Marcus Cole had also developed something else over those hard years. He had developed the ability to absorb cruelty without letting it set him on fire. He had learned that fire only burns the person carrying it. But then Chauncey said something else. Something that changed everything. He said it loud enough for the yard to hear. "You know what'd be funny? Putting this bum on Devil's sermon. Let the horse finish what poverty started." More laughter. A few uncomfortable silences from people nearby who didn't laugh but also didn't speak up, which is a kind of cowardice that's very comfortable and very common. Marcus stopped walking, set down the bucket, turned around slowly, and in a voice that was so calm it was almost frightening, he said, "Which stall is Devil's sermon in?" The laughter didn't stop immediately, but it changed pitch, because there was something in Marcus Cole's eyes that wasn't bravado, wasn't anger, wasn't desperation. It was something much rarer and much more dangerous to a man like Chauncey Aldrich. It was certainty. Scotty Webb, still grinning, pointed toward the far end of Barn 7. "Go right ahead, beggar man. Don't say we didn't warn you." Marcus picked up his bucket, walked toward Barn 7. Behind him, the laughter resumed. Chauncey pulled out his phone and started filming, already composing the caption in his head. He expected a disaster. He expected to post a video of a homeless man running from a wild horse. He expected, at best, entertainment. He could not have been more wrong about what he was about to witness. None of them could, because they were looking at a beggar, and they couldn't see, they were completely incapable of seeing, that what was walking toward Barn 7 was the only horse whisperer alive who understood exactly what Devil's sermon needed. The laughter faded behind him as the barn door swallowed him whole. The horse screamed once from inside. Then silence. A silence so total, so unexpected, that Chauncey Aldrich lowered his phone and felt, for the first time in many comfortable years, a small cold finger of uncertainty run down his spine. Every animal that the world calls dangerous has a story. Every beast that men fear has a wound. The question is never, can it be tamed? The question is always, will anyone bother to listen? Devil's sermon was 17 hands of pure, violent contradiction. He was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. A deep midnight black thoroughbred with a white streak running from his forelock to his muzzle like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh. His bloodline was impeccable. His sire had won 2 Breeders' Cups. His dam had placed at Saratoga 3 consecutive seasons. On paper, he was worth $500,000 and a dynasty of racing glory. In reality, he was a horse that nobody could get near without bleeding. His file read like a police report. Bit a hand off a groom, not literally but close enough to require stitches and a lawsuit. Kicked through not 1 but 2 reinforced stall gates. Through every rider who got within mounting distance. Refused to load into a trailer. Refused to be bridled. Refused to be approached from the left side, the right side, or any angle that involved a human being holding something. 3 separate trainers had worked with him. 3 separate trainers had quit, 2 with injuries. The official conclusion, written by the track's consulting veterinarian after an extensive evaluation, was that Devil's Sermon had severe trauma-based behavioral dysregulation, which is the professional way of saying this horse had been broken in the wrong direction by someone who should never have been allowed near an animal. What the file didn't say, what nobody had taken the time to figure out, was exactly how, who had hurt him, what had been done. The details of his past before he arrived at Harrington Downs at age 3 were vague. A sale in Texas, a previous owner who no longer responded to correspondence, a gap of 8 months that nobody had properly accounted for. In those 8 months, something terrible had happened to Devil's Sermon. You could see it in the way he held his head. Not high and proud the way a thoroughbred naturally carries himself, but low and forward, like he was always waiting for a blow. You could see it in his eyes, which were white-rimmed and rolling even in the quietest moments. You could hear it in the way he vocalized, not the normal nickers and snorts of a horse communicating. These were raw, strangled sounds, the sounds of an animal that had learned that noise brought pain and silence brought different pain, and there was no safe choice. Marcus Cole understood this language, not because he was a horse trainer. He understood it because he had spent years existing in a world where the wrong move got you hurt and the right move got you ignored, and safety was a concept that belonged to other people. He stood at the stall door for 11 minutes before he did anything. Just stood there, not looking directly at the horse, looking at a point on the wall behind him, the way you don't look directly at a frightened dog. Devil's Sermon screamed twice, threw himself against the back wall once, then stood quivering, watching this strange, motionless human with confused eyes. Marcus breathed slowly, deliberately. His hands were loose at his sides. He had set the water bucket down 10 feet back, nothing in his hands, nothing that could be misread as a weapon or a restraint. He was just a man standing near a door, doing absolutely nothing threatening, for as long as it took. It took 11 minutes for the horse to stop trembling. It took 22 minutes for Devil's Sermon to take one step toward the front of the stall. At 31 minutes, Marcus Cole very slowly, very softly, began to hum. Not a song exactly, an old sound from Mississippi. The kind of sound his grandmother made when she was working in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, low and rhythmic and warm as bread. A sound that had no agenda. A sound that asked nothing. Devil's Sermon's ears rotated forward. His head came up not in alarm but in attention, in something that looked carefully, dangerously, like curiosity. Outside the barn, Chauncey Aldridge had his phone out again. He'd expected to film a disaster. Instead, he was filming a silence so strange and so heavy that he'd stopped making jokes. 2 grooms had gathered behind him. Terry, the groom who'd given Marcus the gloves, had his hands clasped together like he was praying. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to break what was happening inside that barn. At the 40-minute mark, Marcus took one single step forward. The horse trembled but did not throw himself backward. At 45 minutes, Marcus raised one hand. Slowly, palm up, fingers relaxed, and held it in the air like an open question. Devil's Sermon stretched his neck forward. His nostrils flared. He smelled the offered hand for a long, suspended moment. And then, gently, with a tenderness that made Terry the groom exhale so hard it sounded like he'd been holding his breath for 40 years, Devil's Sermon pressed his nose into Marcus Cole's palm. A wild horse, a broken man, a barn full of stunned, silent witnesses. The beast had just chosen his human. They say trust is built in drops and lost in buckets. With horses, it's even slower than that. With a broken horse and a broken man, it is built in atoms. Invisible, irreversible atoms. Word spread through Harrington Downs like wildfire through dry grass. By the next morning, the story of the 45-minute standoff had grown in the telling, the way great stories always do, into something slightly mythological. People said Marcus had whispered something in the horse's ear. People said the horse had knelt down. People said a lot of things that weren't exactly true. What was true was this. Devil's Sermon had allowed Marcus Cole to touch him. That alone was extraordinary. That alone was worth talking about. The track manager, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Rowan, came to find Marcus the next morning, while he was back in the outer barns doing the only work he'd been given permission to do. She was direct. She was practical. She had been in the horse business for 30 years and had zero patience for romance but infinite respect for results. "Can you do that again?" she asked. Marcus looked at her. "Do what again?" "Whatever you did yesterday." He thought about it. "Yes." Patricia Rowan looked at him for a long moment, the way people look at something they don't quite have a category for yet. Then she said, "He's got 3 weeks before the owner decides to put him down or sell him to auction. Neither of those options ends well for the horse. If you can make him rideable, actually rideable, I'll pay you for your time and get you a real place to sleep." She didn't make it sound generous. She made it sound like a transaction. Marcus appreciated that more than he could say. "3 weeks is enough," he said. He moved into an empty room above the feed storage that smelled like alfalfa and mice but had a real door and a real lock and a real cot. After months of shelters and bus stations and park benches, it felt like a 5-star hotel. He lay on that cot the first night and stared at the ceiling and let himself feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. The work with Devil's Sermon was not fast. It was not cinematic. It was not the kind of thing that makes for an easy montage. It was slow, daily, repetitive, trust-building labor that most people don't have the patience for because most people have never been desperate enough to develop patience. Day 1. Marcus stood at the stall door for an hour. Let the horse come to him. Left without pushing for anything more. Day 2. He sat inside the stall, back against the wall, reading aloud from a paperback novel someone had left in the feed room. Not to the horse, just reading. Just existing in the same space without agenda. Devil's Sermon would circle him for the first 20 minutes of every session. Always watching, always calculating. Marcus never flinched, never moved quickly, never reacted to the posturing. He had been stared at by hostile men on dangerous streets. A horse's suspicion held no terror for him. Day 4. The horse ate from his hand. Day 6. Marcus ran his palm along the horse's neck for the first time without Devil's Sermon pulling away. Day 8. He introduced a soft cloth. No bridle, nothing constraining, just a cloth. And let the horse investigate it at his own pace. What Marcus understood, intuitively and deeply, was that Devil's Sermon's violence was not aggression. It was anticipatory defense. He was striking out before being struck. He was destroying before being destroyed. He had learned that human contact preceded pain, and so human contact had to be preemptively eliminated. The cure for that was not dominance. It was not the old breaking methods that some trainers still used. Flooding, pressure, exhaustion until compliance. Those methods would have confirmed every terrible thing Devil's Sermon already believed about humans. The cure was predictability. The cure was showing up every single day, at the same time with the same calm energy, making the same promises with your body. I will not hurt you. I will not surprise you. I am safe. I am safe. I am safe, until that message drilled through the layers of trauma and landed somewhere in the animal's ancient brain and became, slowly, a new kind of knowledge. By the end of the 2nd week, Devil's Sermon was following Marcus around the paddock with his nose 6 inches from the man's shoulder. Terry the groom watched this happen one morning and said, quietly, to no one in particular, "I have been around horses my whole life. I have never seen anything like this man." Even Davis Fontaine, the trainer who had looked away during Chauncey's mockery, came to watch one afternoon. He watched for a long time. Then he pulled Patricia Rowan aside and said something that would change the course of everything. He said, "That horse is going to run. And if he runs the way he moves in that paddock, we may have something extraordinary." The atoms of trust had been accumulating, invisible and irreversible, for 14 days. And in the physics of second chances, those atoms were beginning to form something that looked very much like a miracle. Redemption doesn't look like the movies. It doesn't arrive in golden light with a swelling soundtrack. It arrives at 4:45 in the morning smelling like manure and straw, and it asks you to get up and do the work again. Week 3 began with a decision that made Patricia Rowan nervous and excited Chauncey Aldridge for entirely the wrong reasons. The decision was this: Marcus Cole would ride Devil's Sermon. Not in a race. Not yet. Just a riding session. Just to see if the bond they had built in the paddock could survive the introduction of a rider's weight, that fundamental shift in the horse-human dynamic that had previously sent Devil's Sermon into a frenzy every single time. The professional jockeys at the track gathered at various distances that morning, some openly, some pretending to be busy with something else. Chauncey was there with his phone again. He'd been waiting for his disaster video and was starting to suspect, with a growing unease, that he was actually witnessing something different. Marcus approached the horse in the mounting area. No fanfare, no audience playing. Just the same thing it had always been. Two beings who had spent 3 weeks learning the grammar of each other's presence. He ran his hand along Devil's Sermon's back in the long, slow strokes that by now the horse recognized. The horse's ears swiveled forward. His breathing was steady. Marcus put his left foot in the stirrup. Paused. Let the horse feel the weight shift without completing it. Devil's Sermon tensed slightly, the old instinct firing, the old fear rising. But Marcus was already humming, that same low Mississippi sound, and the tension passed like a cloud shadow passing over a field. He put his full weight in the saddle. Devil's Sermon stood completely still. Then, slowly, like he was testing a new word in a foreign language, he took a step forward. Then another. Somewhere behind the fence, someone started clapping. Then more people. Even Chauncey Aldridge put his phone down. Even Scotty Webb, with his turquoise belt buckle and his foghorn voice, went quiet. That first ride was barely a walk. 20 minutes around the training ring at a slow, careful walk, the big black horse and the man in borrowed boots. It was nothing and it was everything. It was, as Terry would later say, the most beautiful thing I ever saw on a racetrack, and I've seen a lot of beautiful things. Over the next 10 days, Marcus and Devil's Sermon moved from a walk to a trot to a full gallop. Each transition was negotiated rather than forced. Each new speed was introduced on the horse's terms, when the horse was ready, without pressure or punishment for hesitation. And when Devil's Sermon finally opened up into a full, unleashed, flat-out gallop, when the horse that had broken 3 trainers and bitten through stall gates decided, entirely of his own accord, to run, what happened was that everyone watching suddenly understood why this horse had a championship bloodline. He was extraordinary. Davis Fontaine, watching with a stopwatch, checked the time twice because he thought the first reading was a glitch. It was not a glitch. Devil's Sermon, on a loose rein, guided by nothing more than the gentle weight shifts of a man who had never been formally trained as a jockey in his life, had just run a quarter mile in 21.4 seconds. World class. Not good for a broken horse. Not good for an amateur rider. World class. Period. Patricia Rowan did not waste time. She went immediately to the horse's owner, a man named Gerald Whitmore, a semi-absentee investor who'd bought Devil's Sermon as a tax position and had been quietly planning to write off the loss, and presented a proposal. Enter the horse in the Harrington Autumn Classic, prize pool $1.2 million, 6 weeks away. Rider Marcus Cole. Gerald Whitmore's response was what you'd expect from a man whose entire relationship with the horse was through quarterly reports. Who the hell is Marcus Cole? Patricia told him. All of it. The bench outside the fence. The mismatched shoes. The 45 minutes in barn 7. The stopwatch reading that Davis Fontaine had now verified 4 times. Whitmore went quiet for a long moment. Then, does he have a jockey license? We're working on it, Patricia said, which was a polished way of saying, we will obtain one immediately. An emergency provisional license application was filed. Given Marcus's age, 41, and lack of formal credentials, it was an unusual request. Patricia called in a favor from a racing commissioner she'd known for 20 years. Davis Fontaine wrote a 3-page letter. Terry the groom, bless his heart, wrote a letter too, with 2 misspellings and more conviction than most professional recommendations ever contain. 6 days before the Harrington Autumn Classic, Marcus Elijah Cole was granted a provisional jockey license by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission. He sat in Patricia's office and held the piece of paper and did not speak for a very long time. When he did speak, his voice was the kind of quiet that comes from somewhere below language. I need a pair of boots, he said. Patricia laughed so hard she had to sit down. There are races that decide money, And there are races that decide something about us, what we believe is possible, who we are willing to cheer for, what kind of stories we need to survive. The morning of the Harrington Autumn Classic arrived cold and clear, the kind of October day that seems designed specifically for drama. The sky was the particular blue that only exists in the American Midwest in fall. A blue so clean and total that it seems like the world has been freshly laundered overnight. 14 horses were entered in the Classic. Among them were 3 horses with formal championship pedigrees, 2 with seasoned jockeys who had Breeders' Cup experience, and 1, listed last in the program at post position 11, that read, Devil's Sermon. Owner Gerald Whitmore. Rider M. Cole. Provisional. The racing press had gotten hold of the story 5 days earlier, when someone leaked the backstory to a regional sports blogger. By race morning, it had exploded. It was on ESPN's morning desk. 3 national newspapers had sent reporters. A CNN correspondent was doing a live broadcast from the paddock. Social media had done what social media does. Stripped the nuance, amplified the arc, turned a complicated human story into a headline that spread globally. Homeless man T.O. ride wild horse in $1.2 million race. Marcus did not know how large this had gotten until he walked into the jockey room that morning, and a colleague he'd never met shook his hand and said, "My grandmother in Alabama sent me your story. She said to tell you she's praying." He spent the 2 hours before the race the same way he'd spent every morning for 6 weeks, with Devil's Sermon. Not training, just being, just existing in the same space, reassuring the horse with proximity and breath and that low Mississippi hum that by now was coded as safety in the horse's rebuilt nervous system. In the paddock, where the horses were presented before the race, the contrast was stark and visual and nobody missed it. The other jockeys were young, mid-20s, most of them, lean and polished in their silks. They had agents and managers and earpieces. Marcus was 41, broad-shouldered from years of labor, wearing borrowed silks that Patricia had sourced in Gerald Whitmore's blue and gold. He looked like a man who had walked into the wrong room and decided to own it anyway. The bettors had made their opinions clear. Devil's Sermon opened at 40-1 odds. Overnight, as the story spread, the odds shifted. Not because the betting public thought they'd win, but because sentimental money started flowing in from people who wanted to be part of the story. By post time, they'd settled at 28-1. Long odds. Nobody's idea of a smart bet. Chauncey Aldridge was in the owner's box. He had spent the past 3 weeks cycling through a range of emotions that he would not have been able to fully articulate. Something between grudging respect and escalating discomfort with his own earlier behavior. He had, at some point in the preceding days, quietly deleted the video from his phone. He had not, however, apologized. These are the small moral calculations of men who are not ready to change. The horses loaded into the gate. Devil's Sermon went in without incident. A minor miracle in itself, for a horse that had once refused to get within 30 feet of a trailer. Marcus sat still in the saddle, weight balanced, hands soft on the reins. He looked straight ahead at the empty track stretching out before them. 1,400 meters. 11 horses between them and clean air. Around the track, 42,000 people had settled into that particular held-breath quiet that precedes a race start, the silence that is really just all the noise compressing into a single point before it explodes. Marcus Cole looked down at Devil's Sermon's neck, at that white lightning bolt stripe between his eyes, at the ears that were now forward and attentive, the breathing that was measured, the posture of a horse who, for the first time perhaps in years, felt safe inside his own body. He pressed his hand once against the side of the horse's neck. Not a command. Not a cue. Just, "I'm here. I've got you. We're okay." The starting gun fired. And Devil's Sermon flew. Not immediately. The first 200 meters were middling. He broke cleanly but found himself boxed in on the inside by 2 faster early starters. Any other jockey would have panicked, tried to force a gap, used the crop, created noise and urgency. Marcus did none of those things. He stayed still, stayed patient, stayed exactly as calm as he'd been in Barn 7 on day 1. The horse felt it and matched it. At the 400-meter mark, a gap opened on the outside. Just enough. Marcus leaned. The gentlest shift of weight, the most subtle communication, And Devil's Sermon responded like he'd been waiting for exactly this signal his entire life. He angled right, found the clear rail, and unleashed something that had been compressed inside him through years of pain and fear and mishandling. He unleashed it all at once. He ran like a horse that had something to prove. Like a horse that finally had permission to be everything he was born to be. The crowd noise went from anticipatory murmur to roar to something beyond roar. Something that is not really a sound anymore but a physical event. A vibration in the chest. A collective human exhalation of "Oh my God. Is this really happening?" A finish line is just a line painted on dirt. What gives it power, what makes crossing it feel like the end of gravity, is everything you carried to get there. Devil's Sermon crossed the finish line 3.5 lengths clear of the second-place horse. 3.5 lengths. In horse racing, that is not a close race. That is not a photo finish. That is a statement. That is a horse telling the world. You had no idea what I was. The track erupted. Not the ordinary eruption of winners and losers calculating their winnings. Something different, rawer. The kind of eruption that happens when human beings collectively witness something that reminds them why stories matter, why underdogs matter, why it is worth it to keep believing in the improbable. In the winner's circle, Marcus Cole sat on Devil's Sermon's back and did not move for a moment. The cameras were flashing. People were screaming his name. His name, Marcus Cole, a name that 2 months ago no one had known, a name that had been invisible on a bus stop bench, and he sat very still and looked at his hands, the hands that had spent 3 weeks making quiet promises to a broken horse, and he felt something shift deep inside him. Something that had been clenched for a very long time, slowly opening. He cried. He didn't try to hide it. He cried in the winner's circle with 42,000 people watching and 17 cameras recording and the crowd noise washing over him like a physical tide. And it was not the crying of sadness. It was the crying of a pressure vessel that has finally been given permission to release. There are different kinds of crying. There is the crying of loss which hollows you out. There is the crying of pain which is its own kind of release. And then there is the crying of a man who has been told, for years in 100 different ways, that he is nothing, and has just proven in front of the whole watching world that he is not nothing. He has never been nothing. He was always something. Gerald Whitmore descended from the owner's box looking like a man who had just watched his tax write-off turn into a legend. He shook Marcus's hand and said something gracious and slightly stunned. Patricia Rowan stood beside the horse with an expression that was professionally composed and privately radiant. Davis Fontaine, the trainer who'd watched away during the mockery, stood at the edge of the circle with his hat in his hands and something complicated in his face. Terry the groom. Terry, who had given Marcus gloves on the first morning, who had written a misspelled letter to the Racing Commission, who had clasped his hands like prayer outside Barn 7. Terry walked up through the crowd and grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and just held on, saying nothing which said everything. The prize check was presented formally. $1,200,000. It is worth dwelling on that number. Not because money is the point, but because money in this world is freedom. It is a door with a number. It is the difference between invisible and present, between the bench outside the fence and the circle inside it. For Marcus Cole, who had been carrying $14.32 on the morning this story began, that number was not just wealth. It was the physical proof that the universe had, at last, corrected an enormous and specific injustice. The press surrounded him immediately, questions in waves. He answered them all with a directness and a humility that immediately became quotable, became viral, became the kind of interview that people save to their phones and return to on difficult days. A reporter asked him, "What was going through your mind when you crossed the finish line?" Marcus looked at her, said, "I was thinking about a horse. I was thinking he finally got to run the way he was born to run. That's all I wanted for him. That's what this was always about." A different reporter asked, "What do you say to the people who doubted you, who laughed at you?" Marcus thought about Chauncey Aldrich, about Scotty Webb, about the specific, comfortable cruelty of men who laugh at other people's pain. He thought about all the years of invisibility, the benches, the shelters, the doors that didn't open. He thought about everything he could say. Then he said, "Nothing. I don't say anything to them. They were wrong. Now they know. That's enough. Later, a journalist would track down Chauncey Aldridge for a comment. Chauncey, who had spent that afternoon watching the race from his box with a face that moved through approximately 14 different emotions, said, "I'm glad for him. It was the most he could manage. It was, perhaps, the beginning of something." Devil's Sermon was cooled down, brushed, fed his favorite treat, peppermints. Marcus had discovered this in week 2, and put to bed in a stall that had been upgraded from Barn 7's far corner to the premium stabling near the track entrance. His paddock board no longer read Untamable in red letters. Someone had replaced the sign. The new sign read, Devil's Sermon, Harrington Autumn Classic Champion. Marcus stood at the stall door that night, long after the crowds had gone and the cameras had packed up and the track had gone quiet and still. He stood there and looked at the horse who had given him back his life, and the horse stood quietly looking back at the man who had given him his. Outside, the October stars were enormous and indifferent and beautiful. America went about its evening. And in a stall in Kentucky, 2 healed things stood together in the dark, breathing. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a movie. This is a story about what happens when one human being refuses, against every reasonable expectation, to stop being gentle in a rough world. Here is what happened after the race. Here is the part that the headlines didn't fully capture, because the headlines had moved on by Monday and the world had found new things to be amazed by. But the aftermath of the Harrington Autumn Classic was not a footnote. It was, in many ways, the actual story. Marcus Cole did not disappear into wealth and silence. He was not that kind of man, and he had not become that kind of man, and he never would be. The prize money was real. The freedom it represented was real. But what he did with it said everything about who he was. He kept working with horses. Not because he had to. He never had to clean a stall or muck a paddock again for the rest of his life if he chose not to. But because the work was not separate from who he was. The work was him. He leased a small property outside Lexington and established what he called, quietly and without ceremony, the Second Chance Stable. The premise was simple. Horses that had been labeled dangerous, unmanageable, or not viable for training, horses that were headed to auction or worse, were brought to Second Chance Stable for evaluation. Marcus worked with them, sometimes alone, sometimes with carefully selected volunteers. He trained himself in the principles of patience and presence and trust building that had no formal name but that Marcus described simply as, "You can't take something from a horse that was never given. You have to give first. You always have to give first." In the first 2 years, 17 horses came through Second Chance. 14 of them were successfully rehabilitated. Several went on to race. One became a therapeutic riding horse at a facility for disabled veterans. 2 became beloved family horses on farms where children rode them in the afternoons, and the darkness that had been in those animals was gone, replaced by the particular contentment of a creature that is finally in the right place. He also started a program for at-risk youth, teenagers from South Chicago and Louisville who were headed in directions that Marcus recognized because he had stood at similar crossroads himself. He brought them to the horses. He didn't lecture them. He didn't hand them brochures. He gave them gloves and asked them to stand beside an animal and practice being still. What the horses taught those kids, Marcus had learned a long time ago. You cannot be present with an animal and be absent from yourself at the same time. Devil's Sermon ran twice more competitively after the Autumn Classic, placing second once and winning once. Then Gerald Whitmore, in a move that surprised everyone including himself, donated the horse to Second Chance Stable after a conversation with Marcus that nobody else was present for and that neither man ever fully recounted. Devil's Sermon spent the rest of his life on Marcus's property, in a large paddock with good grass and other horses and an unlimited supply of peppermints. He was, by all accounts, the happiest horse anyone had ever seen. The story of Marcus Cole became something that circulates. You've probably encountered a version of it, maybe a Facebook post that someone shared in 2024, maybe a YouTube video that autoplay brought you to at 2 in the morning when you couldn't sleep. These versions vary in their details and accuracy. Some of them get specific numbers wrong. Some of them compress the timeline. Some of them leave out the slow parts, the 14 days of paddock work, the daily rebuilding of trust, and make it seem like magic happened faster than it did. But the core of it is always right because the core of it is something true. A man the world had decided was worthless turned out to be exactly what the world most needed. This is not a unique phenomenon. It happens more than we notice because we are not always looking in the right direction. The people carrying the solutions to our most intractable problems are often the same people we've arranged our systems to make invisible. The wisdom that could change things frequently lives in people who haven't been given a room above a feed store to sleep in, much less a platform, a mic, or a winner's circle. What the story of Marcus Cole really says, underneath the racing and the prize money and the triumphant finish, is this: gentleness is not weakness. Patience is not passivity. The ability to stand still in the face of fear and violence and not become either of those things, that is a form of strength that doesn't look impressive from a distance. It doesn't have good optics. It doesn't win you a highlight reel. But it is the rarest and most powerful thing a human being can develop, and it is exactly the thing that broken creatures, whether those creatures are horses or people, most need in order to become whole. Chauncey Aldridge, for what it's worth, eventually called Patricia Rowan and asked for Marcus's contact information. He wanted to make a donation to Second Chance Stable. The donation was accepted. It was not acknowledged with fanfare. Life is complicated, and so are people, and Marcus Cole had bigger things to do than organize a man's redemption arc for him. Scotty Webb still talks too loud. Some things don't change. Terry the groom still works at Harrington Downs. He keeps the original handwritten letter he wrote to the Racing Commission in a frame on his wall at home. When people ask about it, he tells the whole story, start to finish, always ending the same way. The horse knew. Right from the beginning, the horse knew. Animals always know. And Marcus Cole, former Invisible Man, former beggar in mismatched shoes, now someone the horse industry talks about in reverent and slightly disbelieving tones, gets up every morning before dawn. He walks out to the paddock. The dew is on the grass. The sky is doing whatever the sky does. A big black horse with a lightning bolt on his face walks over, ears forward, nose already reaching. And Marcus Cole puts his hand on Devil Sermon's neck. And the horse exhales, long and slow and full, the way horses breathe when they are completely, finally, utterly at peace. And both of them stand there in the quiet morning. Healed. Home. Together. End.